What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, wow, this is gonna be an undertaking. Shazam Explained. Jesus, dude, this character's been around for a long time. We did this once with the Joker, where we explained a character who had basically been around since like the dawn of the comic book industry. But this is no small thing. I mean, this is gonna be this is gonna be pretty tough to do. In an effective way anyway. But I think we could probably pull it off. So originally Shazam made his appearance back in Whiz Comics #2 in February of 1940, and he was created by Bill Parker and C.C. Beck. Now, conventional wisdom tells us that the creation instead of calling him Captain Marvel, we're just going to call him Shazam, and I'll explain why once we get to the 1970s and the attempt by DC to bring his character back. But conventional wisdom tells us that the creation of Shazam was brought about due to the success of Superman. But in reality, that was the creation of a lot of characters, right? Shazam wasn't the only one who was like that. You guys got to remember, when Superman first showed up in Action Comics #1 and the superhero genre was off to the races, it was a great gold rush. Like, it's one of those, it was basically a popular trend. That's one of the things you see. A trend becomes popular and then everybody jumps onto it, right? Like IGN never had a reason to cover comic books until comic books became popular because of the movies. Then they had a reason to start chasing the trend. And so when you start looking at those things, it's the nature of this whole, of everything that we exist in. And so when you look at characters as a whole, by and large, Fawcett was not very smart about it. And that's one of the big things that they ran into. We'll talk about that here in a second. But nonetheless, when Shazam first showed up, it was Bill Parker, it was C.C. Beck, and it was Fawcett Publications. Now, the way this worked back then was during the 1940s and really prior to that, when we started getting into like before Action Comics #1. So basically, almost any era between the late 1920s and the late 1930s, for about that 10-year window, you had what were called pulp magazines. And pulp magazines were basically just stories that were dealing with individuals of, fantastic tales, but weren't really superheroes, which is to say they didn't have like boots and capes and powers and things like that. They didn't really exist. You had like Phantom Stranger, you had Doc Savage, different things like that, but that was really about it. When Superman came onto the scene, it brought in the comic book landscape, and then in turn, Fawcett Publications, which was largely a publisher of like news strips and pulp magazines and things like that, jumped onto the trend. And so Fawcett Publications created a comic book arm called Fawcett Comics, and then you basically had them say like, let's create Superman. And so again, that's kind of where things get a little murky. It's because conventional wisdom is one thing, the truth is another. And so we don't really know what the actual story is, or at least I haven't been able to find it. Every story that I've looked at has basically said, the president of Fawcett said, give me Superman without Superman, thus we got Shazam. And with that being the case, he kind of went forward accordingly. And that's one of the things to bear in mind, is that with Whiz Comics #2 and the introduction of Billy Batson, he was crazy popular. I mean, he outsold Superman by a huge margin. I mean, he wasn't even funny. There's a reason DC sued Fawcett Publications, and it had nothing to do with any actual concern over copyright. It had everything to do with the fact that like readers who were buying Captain Marvel could have been readers who were buying Superman. And because the two were so closely intertwined in terms of their power, the result was that DC had at least essentially seemed to have a legitimate beef over what was going on with regards to the character of Shazam. But in the beginning, when Billy Batson showed up, like a lot of other characters, he was part of an anthology book, this anthology book being Whiz Comics. So it was one of a series of stories that were being published in this one particular book, but Shazam was the standout star. And so what ended up happening here is that by the following year, he got his own solo series, which again was hugely popular, and it lasted some time that really went up to like around 1951, 1952. And the reason why I say that is for several reasons. In reality, one of the things we've talked about over the years, if we've talked about the collapse of the comic book industry, then the near collapse of the industry following the end of World War II. Superheroes existed before before the United States became involved in World War II, but the popularity of superheroes didn't actually pick up until World War II. And the reason why was because you were talking about characters, unless you were Superman or Batman, you were talking about characters who were basically, using their fantastic powers to fight alongside the Allied powers against the Axis powers. And so it worked for the purpose that it served. The result was that by the time World War II ended, people were tired of conflict. They didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. And so the result was that you ended up seeing comic book characters begin to drop off. But in the solo series, a lot of things were basically beginning to come underway. You had Bill Parker, C.C. Beck, who created Shazam himself, and then you had other characters who started popping up. You had Captain Marvel Jr., Freddie Freeman, who was created by France Herron and Mac Raboy, and then you had Mary Marvel, who was created by Otto Bender. Now, Otto Bender coming on was a result of the fact that Bill Parker had been drafted into the military. And so really, this was like Otto Bender's first foray into comic books when he created Mary Marvel. But the fact remains, for Captain Marvel Adventures, this solo series ran not a huge amount of time, but it ran for a pretty good clip. And this meant that as the title continued on and as it became more popular, it became more of a threat to Superman. And so what ended up happening here was that in 1948, there was really what's considered to be a landmark case in the comic book industry, National Comics Publications versus Fawcett Publications. Now, National Comics, again, was one of two companies that would go on to become DC Comics. National and All-American. Fawcett Publications, of course, was by itself. The issue with this for Fawcett Publications was that despite the fact that they were creating other comic books outside of Shazam, he was their standout star. It was that and pretty much nothing else. And while the roster had been built over the years, it all centered around Shazam. So if they lost him, they lost everybody that came with him. So Black Adam from Otto Bender and Mary Marvel and Captain Marvel Jr. and Dr. Savannah and all that kind of stuff. And so as a result of this, in 1948, the case went to trial, and you ended up having the presiding judge who basically said, well, DC screwed up, that the National Allied screwed up. When they initially went through and published Superman, that they let the copyright lapse on several instances of his character, specifically the newspaper strips. And this basically allowed Fawcett to essentially come in and create what was effectively a knockoff of Superman and be well within their rights to do so. DC responded by filing the correct copyright and then in turn appealed the decision. This went to 1951 and 1952, which went to Judge Billings' hand. And Judge Billings' hand passed down the ruling and saying that in and of himself, Shazam is not necessarily an infringement on the character of Superman, but the things that he was able to do was basically the infringement, which is actually a legitimate case. And so as a result of this, DC in turn won the ruling to some degree. I mean, Fawcett was going to appeal, but the result was that they were essentially drained of money. I mean, the character had dropped off in sales, so they basically had a loss of sales going for them. They were losing money left and right. Superheroes were becoming less popular. There was no real way for them to revitalize interest in Shazam, and so they essentially settled. And what this did is it led to a decision that was made between both companies where Shazam would no longer be printed by Fawcett. They would still essentially own the character, but they couldn't publish any stories about him, so they really couldn't do anything with him. And so the result was that following that, Shazam disappeared off the shelves of comics for quite some time, and then in turn, that went to Superman becoming the character that we all know, kind of setting the stage and opening the field for him to become widely popular under like Mort Weisinger and people like that. And so this goes directly into DC trying to revive it. Now, this was a byproduct of an effort for DC to like bring back superheroes, right? We talked about this over the years in different videos that we've done, that following the near collapse of the industry after World War II, the lack of superheroes and the rise in popularity of the horror and science fiction genre, that in 1956 with DC Showcase number 4, DC editor Julius Schwartz brought in Barry Allen, and that re-sparked interest in superheroes by blending science fiction themes with traditional superhero roles. The idea behind this was that over the years, really in 1967, Marvel Comics had already created the character of Captain Marvel, and this is where things tend to confuse people. At the original outset, the first character to ever use the name Captain Marvel was Billy Batson under Fawcett, but by the time the character had been brought back, copyright for the name had basically lapsed. And so what this meant was that when DC in 1973 sought to bring back the character of Billy Batson, they couldn't use the name Captain Marvel on the cover because Marvel Comics had claimed it. And so that's when things really begin to confuse people. So as it stands right now, at the time this video is being written and forevermore, Marvel Comics will own the name Captain Marvel in terms of the cover form for the character. In terms of the first person to ever actually use the name, that's Billy Batson. But because of the fact that the character really couldn't be used anymore by DC, they simply rechristened him as being the character Shazam, simply because of the fact that that's the word he shouted in order to gain his powers. And that was the interesting thing behind all this, is because when you look at the original origin of Billy back in the 1940s, he was basically a kid who was on tough times, and he was taken into a subway system by a guy wearing a trench coat, and he was brought before an old man who said, if you say this word Shazam, then in turn you will gain powers and you can go forward as a hero, and so on and so forth. But that's what made Billy so popular, is because Billy was basically a kid who worked for the Whiz radio station and would essentially break the fourth wall by addressing the reader and saying, hey guys, here's what here's what Captain Marvel did today, and then tell the whole story of what it was that happened to go on and so on and so forth. But again, going into 1973 and the attempt by DC to revitalize the character, there were a lot of moving pieces at work here. The first was that you had Carmine Infantino, who was really one of the big pushers of DC during like the 60s and 70s and somewhat during the 80s, but then you also had like the creation of the multiverse. In 1961, we got the Flash of Two Worlds and the advent of the multiverse proper. And so when DC went back and said, okay, let's bring back Shazam, or let's bring back Billy Batson, and we'll simply call him Captain Marvel, they immediately got a cease and desist letter from Marvel Comics. And they said, stop using that name. And so what this meant was that from that point going forward, Billy Batson could be called Captain Marvel within the confines of the comic, but the name couldn't actually be put on the cover. So therefore, we got Shazam. Now, with this being the case, because of the fact that the 1960s, the late 1950s and the mid 1960s was essentially just like a reshuffling of the DC landscape, creating new origin stories, the idea was to bring back Billy Batson and then kind of remove him from like the Fawcett Comics era to keep some of those things stories intact, but then in turn kind of rework the character. And so what we ended up getting here was DC sitting down and saying, okay, the subcaption, the original Captain Marvel can't fit. We'll just call him Shazam, and then it'll be considered the world's mightiest mortal, and we'll start that with issue number 15. But going forward from there, what we actually got were essentially 2-in-1s with regards to these comic books. You got basically reprints of the old Fawcett Comics stories, and then you got new stories featuring the character of Shazam. And this was designed for a very specific purpose. For people who were coming into the character of Shazam, by and large, they didn't know who he was. Billy Batson, he'd been gone for 20 years by the time his character showed up. So for people who were going in and reading comics, for the most part, had no clue who he was. And so we basically got Dennis O'Neil, who was writing the comics, and we got essentially backup features, these old Fawcett Publication stories alongside news stories, so that people could basically get caught up on a lot of the supporting characters. The other question that people had is they said, how is it that this character has basically been gone for 20 years and nobody knew where he went to? And so in a story, and really in a combination of stories, we ended up getting this explanation that somewhere along the line, Dr. Sivana had faced off against Shazam and the Captain Marvel family, and then froze them in suspended animation. And what this did is it allowed DC to bring the character back. The problem with this was that Superman was still wildly popular. They didn't want to oversaturate the market with too many Superman-esque characters. And so what this meant was that DC invoked the multiverse, and where you had like Earth 1, which was the main superheroes in DC that fought alongside Barry Allen, where you had Earth 2, which was where you had like Jay Garrick, the Flash, and so on and so forth, we got Earth S. And what Earth S did is it basically allowed DC to bring back the character of Shazam and then throw him into his own universe and say everything he does here is totally self-contained and doesn't impact anything else in the DC universe. He did cross over. Occasionally he would cross over with other characters, but for the most part, that was really all there was to it. This whole idea with Shazam trying to bring him back lasted about 34 issues. It didn't last very long. And even then, issue number 35 was really more of like a backup feature that was published in the World's Finest Comics. Now, the reason why the revival of Shazam didn't work out and only ran for about 34, 35 issues was because people didn't like the idea of having a character like that in a totally self-contained universe. By this point in time, a shared universe existed. Batman, Superman meet for the first time in Superman number 76. They team up, they stop a jewelry heist on a cruise ship, and then now like we know that Gotham City and Metropolis exist on the same Earth. The characters start crossing over, so on and so forth. Because that was part and parcel to the landscape at the time, what was being given here with Shazam was essentially an anomaly, something that people didn't want to see. In addition to this, you're talking about a return to a character who is written in isolation almost 13 years after the Justice League had been formed. Nobody wanted to see this. And so one of the last-ditch efforts that was made by DC to kind of revitalize this character came with E. Nelson Bridwell, Alan Weiss, and Joe Rubenstein, as well as Don Newton, which was to kind of like create more tangible and grounded stories as opposed to more fantastic tales of science fiction themes and stuff like that. But again, didn't really work out. And so the result of this was that by the time you ended up getting into the later issues of World's Finest and so on and so forth, the whole thing had basically just been like dropped off. Now, following that, like what DC had at the time was essentially leftover material. They had stories that just weren't going to be able to be published because of the fact that this solo series had been canceled. And so over the course of really like, September to October of 1982, what we ended up getting were like these little leftover holdover stories published in like Adventure Comics, World's Finest, different things like that, just sort of letting it drop off. Now, following this and going into 1986, really like the post-crisis landscape, under Roy Thomas, DC tried to rework the character of Shazam yet again. The problem with this was that it was fraught with nothing but just editorial problems and ultimately didn't really see the light of day. The idea behind this came out of a 1986 miniseries that was called Legends. And Legends was really a way for Keith Giffen and JMD Mateus to kind of springboard like new characters and stories. And so what they did is they reintroduced Shazam as part of the Legends series. That way it would kind of equate new readers with who his character was. And then in turn, that would spin off into its own solo series that was supposed to be called Shazam: The New Beginning. Now, this was written by Roy Thomas. There were a host of other artists. The problem with this was that it didn't work out because there were just a whole bunch of editorial problems. It was really Roy Thomas bumping heads with DC pretty consistently. And so the result was that ultimately it never really came to fruition. We never really saw anything come out of it. And so for the most part, between 1986 running up until about 1989, there were efforts that were made by guys like John Byrne and so on and so forth to try to like bring Shazam back, but it never really worked that well. And nothing ever really came out of it. And so the reality of this was that from the time that his series was canceled pre-crisis up until about 1991, he'd vanished yet again. Now in 1991, this saw Jerry Ordway come on by basically writing a series called The Power of Shazam. Now in reality, The Power of Shazam, well, at least the way it was originally done, is it was a graphic novel. And the graphic novel would be thrown out there by DC in an effort to test reception, and if people liked it, go into a solo series. And in truth, like the original graphic novel was hugely popular. Oh, people loved it because what this did is it basically took a look at the character of Shazam from the time he was first introduced, running all the way up to his cancellation in 1952, 1953, his return into the mid-1970s, his eventual cancellation again, and then an attempt to return him in 1986, looked at that whole thing and basically said, what's essential here? And what it did is it wiped out everything that basically came post-Crisis. So like Shazam, The New Beginning was essentially gone. The stories were written by John Byrne in Action Comics. Those were basically gone. Instead, what the story did is it took the character of Billy all the way back to his roots, to the old Fawcett Publications stories, and then kind of like redid his origin, but maintained the themes that would keep it updated for the modern reader. Now, because of the fact that the graphic novel was so popular, this led to the actual solo series itself, which ran for about 47 issues, but 46 of them were written by Jerry Ordway. Now, for most people out there who are familiar with the character of Shazam, this is usually where they started. And so that's one of the reasons why there are so many fans out there for his character who love this era, who love like this run, this 46 issue run by Jerry Ordway, because for them, it's the definitive run that established him. The problem with this was that, again, DC was really kind of experiencing a tumultuous time with their landscape after Crisis on Infinite Earths, because where that story was designed to kind of clear the landscape of the multiverse and to sort of reset everything, to essentially reboot, there were still themes that were kind of left hanging. And so you went into like 1993, 1994, 1995, you go into like, 0 Hour Crisis in Time, you go into the mid-2000s where you have Infinite Crisis, and then you have Final Crisis, and you have like all these stories that were worked on in an effort to kind of like rework the DC landscape. Shazam was kind of caught in the middle of it all, and so what this meant was that for his character, following the conclusion of the Power of Shazam story, instead of DC canceling him, what they actually did is they threw him on a series of different publications. For example, he showed up in JSA during the events of 52, with regards to Infinite Crisis. You ended up having Mary Marvel, who basically lost her powers, and then you had Captain Marvel Jr., who lost his powers, all as a result of the Days of Vengeance, when the original Shazam, or I guess really the Wizard Shazam, the one who gave them all their powers, was killed by the Spectre. This led to Billy Batson basically leaving his role as being Shazam the superhero, and then going to be the Wizard Shazam on the Rock of Eternity, which left the role of the Earth superhero Shazam open, which they tried to fill with Captain Marvel Jr. It was all these different efforts to kind of like try to rework the Shazam mythos. The issue with this was that for the most part, not enough had really been done to warrant reworking his character. You're talking about a 46 issue monthly series, so 46 months pass. So, around 4 years pass, and Shazam is just now really being introduced to like the readership out there. But because of the fact that the sales were slumping a little bit, and because DC was trying to rework things, they essentially reworked them unnecessarily. And so what this basically meant was that people were a little more confused, and really the stories were a little worse for wear following this whole reshuffling and so on and so forth. And so what this basically meant was that going from the time that Power of Shazam ended with issue number 47, so we're talking 1999, running all the way up until 2011, Shazam never had a solo series. It was really just him and other people, other members of the Marvel family, who were featured in like different books. It was one of these scenarios where his character kind of bounced around, but it also gave people the ability to see him in ways they wouldn't normally be able to see him. If his solo book wasn't selling that well, then that meant that nobody was really reading it. And if nobody was really reading it, then it meant that most people weren't really familiar with what his character was about, what was going on. And if that was the case, then put him on JSA, a book that's selling better, written by Jeff Johns, and then give people, an intro to his character. It was kind of a way to sort of go back and to say, okay, let's try this again, but in a different way. Now, one of the other cool things that again came out of this, the Trial of Shazam, was this 12-issue maxi series. It was basically saying, okay, let's rework the character of Captain Marvel. Let's rework the character of Captain Marvel Jr. Let's rework the character of Mary Marvel. And so what this did is it actually led to Freddie Freeman trying to prove himself worthy of taking over the character of Shazam following the death of the Wizard Shazam, and Billy Batson taking over the Wizard of Shazam's role. So again, it was kind of a way to sort of rework them, to get people interested in seeing them in a different way. But at the end of the day, it just didn't quite stick. It was cool, but it just didn't quite stick that well. And so this goes into 2011 with a line-wide DC reboot. Now, in reality, the 2011 reboot of DC, of course, as most people know by now, was line-wide, which basically meant that it was essentially DC rebooting everything, basically saying like it all starts all over again. But for the character of Shazam, he was reworked in its entirety. But this is one of those scenarios where fans were really kind of split the fan base. For people who were new or who got into Shazam after the events of the Power of Shazam storylines, and after really his character was kind of reworked, before New 52, for them it didn't really matter. It was kind of like, hey, like that works for me. The issue with this was that for longtime fans, they felt a little bit betrayed. And the reason why was because when you went and you looked at like Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis's runs, when you looked at the runs of like Jerry Ordway, different things had taken place. One of the major scenarios that had come along with this character was that where you looked at old school comics from like the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was this idea that Billy Batson would become Shazam, and then Shazam was his own total personality. He was a whole other person. It was like Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk. But when you got into like later storytellings that were done into the 1990s and really the early to mid 2000s, it was one of these things where like Billy Batson becomes Shazam, but Billy Batson's still there. He still kind of has like this childlike innocence innocence about him, which is what a lot of people loved. It was kind of like the best of both worlds. It really kind of split the fan base. And that's an important thing for you guys to be aware of, is that when it comes to characters like Shazam, he does not have the biggest fan base in the world, but those who are fans of him are hardcore. They are intense fans of him. And again, I mean, with a character that's been around this long, we kind of have to leave some stuff out. But the fact remains that when it came to this whole thing, you had like a kind of character redesign, you had these small little things that went on, but one of the most notable instances of Shazam in the New 52 era is he didn't have a solo series. And the reality of this was because there was just really no room for it. DC was publishing like a ton of comic books, and the character of Shazam was a gamble. The reality of this is that there's no guarantee his character will sell. And so it was a very big publication risk, given the amount of money that was already being put forward with the existing line of comics, to throw Shazam into his own book and see what would happen. And so what this meant was that with issue number 7 of Justice League, New 52 Justice League, running all the way up until issue number 21, he received backup. He was basically a backup feature, meaning that he was at the end of the book. Now this was designed to basically kind of rework him in his entirety, but also bring back everything that fans were familiar with. So Mary Marvel came back and Freddie Freeman came back, and then there were like introductions of new characters that kind of expanded the Shazam lineup and different things along those lines. But it was basically, it served the purpose of kind of like returning him to familiarity, but also sort of making him new. The problem with this was that the backup features ended, and then he in turn joined the Justice League, fought alongside the Justice League into things like Trinity War, Forever Evil, and Darkseid War, and so on and so forth. His powers were changed up, but then Rebirth happened and he vanished, and nobody knows where he's been ever since. We saw him once in Hellblazer Rebirth, but he was there when Wonder Woman was talking to him for a minute or two and just said, well, we'll let Constantine do his own thing, and we don't know where he's been ever since. We have no idea what he's doing. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people who were looking at the upcoming solo series right now kind of have this take where they say, we don't know how to view this. We don't know if what Jeff Johns is going to do is continue what was done in the New 52 reboot, or if he's going to rework the character in his entirety, and we're going to get a return to the Power of Shazam stories. One half of the fan base wants to return to the way things used to be, and then you want fans who want to return, who basically want a whole new take on the character. We won't know until the book drops. But again, this is a character that's been around for a long time. Being able to cover him in his entirety, that's a multi-part series. I mean, you're talking about like a 7-part series on the history of his character if you want to cover everything. But that's one of the crazy things, is that over the years, the powers of Shazam have also sort of been reworked, in a large number of ways. In the old stories, if Billy said the word Shazam under any circumstance, he would change. In later stories, that began to shift away, because then you started running into problems. Well, what happens if Billy, if he's walking down the road and somebody runs up on him with a sign that says Shazam, and then he says it, does he turn into Shazam? Billy accidentally says Shazam or something along those lines. But again, in order to tell practical stories, that essentially went away. Originally, it was based off the idea that each letter stood for a particular character that he gained his powers from. So S was the wisdom of Solomon, H was the strength of Hercules, A was the stamina of Atlas, Z was the power of Zeus, A was the courage of Achilles, and then M for the speed of Mercury. And that was really it. The characters that he's gotten his powers have changed over time, especially when you get into Darkseid War. It's a whole new host of gods. But by and large, it always stays the same. The basis of his powers almost never ever change. Wisdom, strength, stamina, raw power, courage, and speed. Those are kind of universal across the board. The powers of Superman. They never really shift. But again, his characters also sort of intertwined with magic. And that was one of the big differences between Shazam and Superman proper. His Superman was basically just what would happen if a guy was an alien and he was exposed to a yellow sun? And then he was just really strong and powerful. And that's it. It's basically the mutation of his cells that give him his abilities. Billy gets his powers from magic. And it's one of the reasons why whenever you see him go in an all-out knockdown, drag-out brawl with Superman, that he can usually win, because Superman has a weakness to magic. So it's one of those strange little situations that goes on there. But it's kind of a cool situation, nonetheless. Hopefully this video gets you guys prepped enough to understand what's going on with this character. Again, there's a lot of history to cover there, and not enough to do it all in a reasonable amount of time. But hopefully it works for you guys, and hopefully it gets you guys pretty prepped for his character. But with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.